So tonight's landscape design with Elizabeth Killinger. She's an extension educator out in Hall County. She is going to go over landscape design, basic principles, and then do a really cool hands-on project that you guys will do tonight. So I don't know, some of you might have brought your stuff, some of your coordinators brought stuff for you, but we will let Elizabeth get going and we will start landscape design. Go ahead, Elizabeth.
All right, thanks, Terry. Like Terry said, tonight we're going to talk about landscape design. And I don't know how many different master gardeners we have across the state or how many people are on. But what we're going to talk about is we're going to talk about the principles and elements of design first. So what that means is some of you might be a little frustrated because I'm not going to tell you what to put where because it's all personal preference when it comes down to it. So to start off, we are going to talk about the landscape design principles. Then we're going to move into the elements portion. And then, like Terry said, we're going to do that hands-on activity. And what we're going to do is we're going to review some of the design principles and the design elements that you learned in the earlier portion. And we're going to put it to use with these landscape designs in a box. So pay attention to these principles and elements because you're going to be needing them later. And if we have time, we're going to talk about some of the common landscape mistakes. So if you have questions, feel free to let me know as we go along. You can either do it in chat or you can unmute yourself and pipe up and let me know. And like Terry said, if you have a question and you're trying to point something out and I'm just not figuring it out, go ahead and use that annotate and you can draw or point on that so that way I can see what you're talking about. So to start off, we're going to go and we're going to look at the principles. And these are the principles as they're laid out and how I'm going to talk about them. Order design framework. Then we're going to talk about balance, repetition, and then we're going to talk about that proportion or scale, rhythm, unity, and then emphasis. So start off, we're going to do that order and design framework. And what the order design framework is it's the big picture. Like that is the entire landscape. We're not just looking at one little portion of the landscape. We're not just looking at the backyard in the corner. We're looking at the picture as a whole. The entire backyard or what somebody might see from the street. So what we're going to do is we're going to use a consistent design theme, whether that's formal, informal, or natural. And we'll talk a little bit more in detail what that means. But we want to make sure we use the same theme throughout because it might look a little funny if we use one in the front yard and a different one in the backyard or try to mix them together. When we do plants, and we'll talk more about plant considerations a little bit later on, but we want to try to group those plants together. And the reason we want to do that is we want to help to enhance those plants and what they look like. So if we put them together, we get more emphasis on them. We get more visual aesthetics from them. And then with plants, normally we like to do odd numbers. And the reason for that is if there's two of something, your eye is bouncing back and forth between those two things. If we add a third thing in there, then your eye is more easily, it's pleasing to the eye. It's not bouncing back and forth. Don't ask me why they sell roses in half dozen and in dozen counts though. Because we think about odd numbers as being ideal, but roses are always sold by the half dozen. So if you figure that out, let me know. So we also need to make sure in that order design framework is, does this landscape make sense? Does it match? Is it go with the rest of the landscape if we're doing one portion this way and another way? Are they going to make sense and are they going to work well together? So we had a few pictures to start off after we talk about balance. So with balance, we have two different kinds. We have symmetrical, which means it's a center axis. What's on one half is what's on the other half. The good news is it's the easiest to design because you take a look and you go, what do I have on this side? What do I have on that side? Is it the same? Now think about what happens as that landscape begins to age. Think about what happens when a plant that doesn't read the plant tag dies on one side. What happens on the other side? Do you try to remove it? Do you try to decide what to do with that? Do you take it out? Do you try to put a new plant in the place where that one has died? If so, are you going to shell out the big bucks to get that large plant that matches the one on the other side? Or is it going to look a little funny if you put in a brand new little plant in that place? So that's one of the downsides with the symmetrical is, yes, it's easiest to design when you have equal things on both sides. But like I said, what happens if something dies or life happens or plants just don't do as well in that location? The next one is asymmetrical. What it does is it's still the same visual weight. So you might have a large shrub on one side and you might have a small tree on the other side. And visually they're going to be about the same size, but we're talking different plant material. It gives it its visual balance, but like I said, we're looking a little different. So that's something to keep in mind too, is not everything has to be what's equal on one side is exactly on the other side, but we still want to give it the same visual weight. We don't want a puny little plant on one side and a huge plant on the other side. Then it looks like the building's going to topple over, or it might look like that landscape is unbalanced. So when we take a look at this first picture, when we're talking about balance, what kind of balance do you think this is? Or are we looking at formal? Are we looking at symmetrical? Or are we looking for asymmetrical? I'm taking votes. Symmetrical or asymmetrical? Any guesses? This is the part where we interact. Thank you, Panhandle and Sydney and David. So what we have is we have symmetrical. If we take a look at the walk, what is on one side is on the other side. We mirror the same. We have the boxwoods on the flanking. We've got those salvias on those, and then we have the roses on the inside. And as we get closer to that column, we also have those two upright plants on either side of the column. Now think about what happens if one of these boxwoods down in front dies. Do we try to make the other side match, or do we try to fill it in? And that's just something that you have to make as a call at that point in time. So how about on these next slides? Again, looking for interaction. Are we looking symmetrical or are we looking asymmetrical? Awesome. So that's right. All those that have typed in, we are looking at asymmetrical. And let's just pretend that we take this big oak tree out of the front yard. If we take the big oak tree out of the front yard, everything in the landscape has about the equal amount of weight. There's not one thing that outweighs the other thing. There's nothing big and bold on either side in front of that house. The biggest thing we have is right here in front of that porch. So if we pretend like that big oak tree isn't there, then we're looking at really, really asymmetrical. The tree, it's doing its job, it's looking good in that location, but we are looking at asymmetrical. I hope you guys are able to rattle it off right away or type it in. So even the house itself is symmetrical. And even though we don't have a bay window on this side, we still have windows on that side that mirror that. So if we cut that house right down the middle, what is on one side is what is on the other side, except for one side you have a car and one side you have a basketball hoop. But even the front planters, we've got those round little boxwood hedges in both of our planters. We've got our yew shrub followed by little meatball in the front, two big meatballs on one little tiny meatball, and then we've got our hedge in front too. So this one is very, very symmetrical. What is on one side is what is on the other side. And so that's with that one. And the last one, I promise. With this one, are we looking at symmetrical or asymmetrical? So right, those of you that have typed in, we do have asymmetrical. We don't have equal plant material on both sides. We don't even have the same plant material on both sides, but we give them equal weight. So that way it doesn't look like the house is gonna fall over one side if we take a look at the landscape. We have a small tree right here next to the house. We've got another larger tree outside of the frame of view, but we can still kind of see it. So if we take a look, we're looking at it being a little even, but even though it's asymmetrical. Then we go into that style of landscaping. So if we take a look, some of those landscapes that we had were very, very formal. Like the example of the house that was very symmetrical with the little meatballs out in front. What it is what is on one side is what is on the other side. It's very formal. Sometimes it is very hedged. It's very unforgiving, and it can be a little bit of higher management because you want it to look a specific way. So like I talked about, I've had examples of people have a formal landscape. They've got 4 arborvitaes in a row and the second one in dies. What do? Do you take the first one out and then leave the other 2? Or do you try to fill in that spot? So that's the hard part with that formal design is, you know, if we keep up with it and it's all hedged and sheared and everything looks nice and then something dies on one side, we have some issues. The next one is more informal, and informal is kind of give and take. It's put a specific place for a reason, but they aren't all soldiers in a row, or it's not all equal on both sides. And it's a little bit more forgiving when it comes to this one. So when we look at designing, right off the bat, you either love formal and you want to make everything look the same, or you're gonna like that informal and it's a little bit easier pill to swallow. Now, when we get down to that last one, that natural, it's a little tough for some to handle because it is truly scattergun approach. Wherever things land is where they go. We're looking at like a prairie situation where we don't have any control where those plants are going to live and thrive. Or if we're putting bulbs out in the landscape, we just toss them. And if we are doing that natural style, wherever those bulb lands is where we plant them. So you could have 2 in one spot, you could have 10 in one spot if you have a really bad arm, or you could have some that actually make their way out to the lawn. And if we're following that natural style, we're gonna see those start to do that. So when we take a look, we're taking a look at this one, we're looking at not only very formal is what is on one side is what is on the other side. So we're looking at symmetrical, we're looking at very formal. Like I said, sometimes things are hedged or kept in a specific way. So we've got the little meatballs out in front that are hedged a specific way. So if we move on to the next one, this one is a little bit more informal, kind of on the edge of natural, but what it does is plants are specifically placed in those locations for a reason. And the taller ones are toward the back, the shorter ones are toward the front. So that way we can see those plants from the location where we're looking at them right now. We have the turf that's in the background, and where that turf is at is where those plants stay out of. So that way it's a little bit easy to keep. Like I said, the plants are in their spot for a reason and they live where they live. There's that mix of kind of informally natural with this one, and I like to borrow these pictures, and this is Kim's backyard. But if to the untrained eye, some people might see this as unkept, but it does have that line of where those plants are going to be. We let the plants do their things within the beds, and then they're kept that way for a reason. Compare that with our natural style, like we would with the prairie. We have no control where the solidago is going to come up, where the goldenrod's going to come up. We have no real control on where the big blue stem is going to take over, where the Indian grass is going to take over. Whatever happens is whatever happens. And in that landscape, it does what it wants. So to some, that can look like a weed patch or maybe a little bit unkept, but that's something that we need to keep in mind is natural may be good for some people, but not everybody's going to appreciate that natural style. Some people are going to appreciate that more formal style where everything is kept and the soldiers in a row. And then some people are going to like that informal style where it's a little bit give and take between the two. So when we look at some more of the principles of design, we take a look at their repetition. And what it is it's just like it sounds. We're repeating an element, whether it be a color. We're talking about a form possibly or a shape out in the landscape. It could be a texture that we're using. We could also repeat certain plant material or group plant groupings out in the landscape. We're just using them again in the landscape. The most common mistake is trying to use too many different plants, and we're all probably very guilty of this because we all love plants so much that you see something, at least I do. I have plant ADD. Oh, I see one of those. I want one of those. Oh, I want one of those. And oh, I want one of those. But I don't repeat it through the landscape. So that's something that we need to keep in mind is while we are all plant lovers, we need to make sure that we try to repeat those throughout the landscape to give them a little bit more cohesion. And that repetition helps to contribute to rhythm throughout the landscape. So if we take a look at some of the pictures that we have, what's one thing that pops out as soon as you take a look at this picture? Purple, color, right? We use the color on one side and we use the color on the other side. Now, what's another thing that is repeated in this landscape? If we take a look at the plant material in particular. Grass. Yep, we have grasses on the one side, so that's one type of form or one type of texture. We've repeated this grass here in the front with a little bit of blue. We've got that grass in the back. We have this grass on this side, and that grass is repeated on the opposite side. We've got similar rounded forms. They're different plant materials, but we're repeating that same kind of rounded form with the geranium on that side. And then we've got the lambs here on the other side where we are also repeating that. So we've got some repetition going in the landscape. This one's kind of fun because we're repeating, but we're kind of making a slight nod toward, yep, Panhandle's got it right off the bat. What we're looking at is we're looking at that similar shape, that similar form. When we take a look at those hydrangeas, we've got that cone shape on the end. Then we have that cone shape or that pyramid shape of the evergreens in the background. So we're playing off of those same shapes, those same forms in the background. So we've got another one here. So when we take a look at this one, for one, we're repeating the same color. Go figure, green is a color. But we have similar types of fine textures. So we take a look at the switchgrass and it's got a fairly fine texture. We have the yew. To me, it has a fairly fine texture. And then we have some of the locust in the back room that also has a fine texture. So we could be repeating textures in this one. We're repeating color. We're kind of repeating the form because it's just a wall of green. Different walls of green stepping their way down. We also have to take a look at the proportion or the scale. So relative scale is this size relationship between different landscape elements. So when we take a look at a tree and a shrub, what's going to be bigger? The tree should be bigger than the shrub. So that's the relative scale. The absolute scale is relationship to the human and how it affects you in the landscape. So right off the bat, think of a hedge. Now, how tall is your hedge in your mind? Depends on what you want it to do. Now, if you're just wanting it to be a nice little hedge, you can talk to your neighbor over it. We're probably looking about 3 foot high. You're still able to talk, but it still tells that neighbor, look, this is my property. Stay on your side, I'll stay on mine. If your hedge then goes to 6 foot, it totally changes the space. Now you feel totally enclosed. Now you're giving your neighbor that kind of, I don't want to talk to you. I put this hedge here so I don't have to see you and I don't have to talk to you. And that's just the absolute scale is while you have a 6 foot hedge, it gives you a different appearance in that element. Does that make sense? So relative scale versus absolute scale. Okay. So what these can do is they can make them be intimate spaces or distant spaces. Like I talked about with the hedge, when your hedge is 6 foot, that's a very intimate space. Is you're going to stay within that shrub. You're not able to see out beyond. If we make it 3 foot, then we're able to see out into the distance. We're able to see those vistas, and it really opens up that view and makes it different. So what happens sometimes is where we have large spaces, we put those tiny little perennials in there, and those tiny little perennials tend to get lost. They look super small, and that's just not because they're small in stature. It's because they're in a very large space, and it's overwhelming that little tiny plant. Now, on the other side of the coin is we put those really large perennials or those really large plants in a tiny little space. And when we put them in that tiny little space, what are they going to do? They're going to do what they want to do, and they're going to overwhelm that really small space. They're going to take over. It's not that they're huge, it's just that compared to everything else in that small little space, they're going to take over and be really big. So scale is always a relationship. If you see me next to my mom who's 5 foot tall, you're going to be like Elizabeth is really tall. If you see me next to some of the other educators like Jay Jenkins who's 6'5", you're going to be like Elizabeth is really short. So scale is always a relationship to what is nearby. Scale comes into play in containers too. What it is we can have a super fine little landscape, like think of a fairy garden. That's just a major big landscape shrunk down into tiny little houseplant size. So scale can play into that too. This was kind of a fun picture I saw. So right off the bat, to me anyway, I take a look at the house and then I look at the tree, or if you want to look at the tree, that's fine too. But think about what that tree would look like if it was next to a single-story ranch house. It would look like it's eating the house because that house is so much smaller. In this type of a place where you have that big grand house and you have that big grand tree, they look like they go together. But like I said, if we put that next to a single-story ranch house, that tree is going to eat that little house in no time flat. That also goes for some of the perennials too. If we take a look at all these perennials and they're in the hill strip right next to the church, they're doing their job. They're looking happy. Everybody's playing nice. Now, if we were to back up and this is a huge cathedral church, those little plants are going to look pretty insignificant right next to that plant, like next to that church. So what rhythm is it's organized movement. Now, rhythm can either be visual, where your eye is pulled through the landscape, or it can be physical, where someone is actually moving through the landscape on stepping stones or pathways. So rhythm, not only are these stones evenly placed, and you're not missing one, because can you imagine what would happen if they forgot that one right there? You'd be going along and all of a sudden you miss it. But that rhythm is not only drawing the person, we're physically going through that space, but we also want to know what happens at the end of the path. We want to know, and I want to walk there and see what's at the end of that path. Sometimes it can be suggested, the path throughout the landscape. There is no real walking path in this landscape, but the mulch at least draws your eye around the corner, and it gives you that idea that it's okay, go ahead, walk on the mulch path, or walk on the grass to get out here to the little building out there. And this is a fun one from campus, back when it was there, now, yeah. But the prairie, what they do is you have this path, and the path goes behind the sumac. So we're drawing our eye around through the path, and you want to walk around the sumac and you want to go follow that path to see what's back in here. Spoiler alert, it's a prairie, but it's still back in there, and you want to draw your eye around and you want to move throughout that landscape to see what's back there. So again, for one, I didn't want to plant all those daffodils, but for two, we've got the actual path that leads up to the bridge, and then we have that mode path that's a suggested path that we take. Now everybody wants to know what's up and around this corner, because this is a really cool spot, and I would like to know what is there and what's to come around the corner. But like I said, that rhythm is that movement through the landscape. It either physically moves you or it moves your eye through that landscape. In unity, what unity is that physical linking of those various landscape elements. So what it is a lot of people now are painting their front door a really weird color. Well, why not bring that together and put some containers out in front of your landscape or in front of your front door that maybe pull that color out, whether it be through plant material or maybe the pots have a little tinge of color to them. Maybe you use stone for your retaining wall that matches the stone on your house. Or a lot of people are, we're matching those different elements so we have that unity element. When we did our landscape sign out in front of our extension office, we had to go with the same brick supplier so that way the base of our sign that's on brick matched the brick that was on the building. So that way we linked those two together and we had that element of unity between the two. So repetition and unity work together to create that whole landscape, because when we repeat the similar color, the similar forms, things like that, that helps to create that unity and make a whole landscape. So we talked about unity is linking those elements together. So what is the one element in this picture that is linking it together? That's right, the stone. The stone used for the steps is similar to the stone used on the house. We're repeating that color. We're having unity in the landscape. Things are looking very similar. It brings it together. Now, how weird would it be if you had some off-the-wall crazy color or maybe a different form that didn't match the house? It might not go as well together, but it's still a similar type of stone where you could put it together and we have that unity and that repetition in the landscape. So with this one, what we're looking at is, look at all the different stone that's out in the landscape. So we've got the pavers under the patio are different shapes of stone. Then we've got the stone wall, and then we also have the stone walk. So all of those are similar together, similar elements. We're repeating that same type of form, that same type of texture. Yes, they're a little bit of different color, but I think in this instant it helps to differentiate between the different elements in there. So it specifically says, okay, this is the patio. You are no longer on the walkway. The last one of the principles is emphasis. And when we talk about emphasis, the first thing that you think of is that focal point. It's going to spark your interest. It's going to draw attention when you're viewing the landscape as a whole. It's going to catch your eye. And each major area should have a focal point. The focal point should be in the direction where you want attention to go. So we don't want to put the focal point right by the trash cans. It's just something that happens. We don't want to draw our eye toward that area where we really don't want to see it. So we need to make sure that like the major areas are the public, the private, and the service area. So we really don't need a focal point on the service area. The service area is either the compost bins, or maybe it's the trash cans, or maybe it's the sidewalk that we only use to get into the garage. So with those areas, we really don't have to have a focal point. But on those other areas, like our private area or our public area, the focal point is going to draw interest to make sure it's an area that you want it to be seen. So some people will put their focal point outside their kitchen window so that way they can see it, or maybe off of their deck, maybe by their front door, are just some examples of where that focal point will be at. I don't know about you, but if I was to pull up to this house The house itself wouldn't catch my eye quite as much as the waterfall just outside their door. That's pretty much a focal point, and it's strategically placed so it'll draws your eye right up to that door. We've also got some flowering roses right next to it. We've got some pond loving plants. We've got some water plants in there, but they also, I'll throw it in here now. So when we look at this, are we looking at an asymmetrical or are we looking at symmetrical? And how weird would it be if we would have put that little waterfall off to the side? It would look pretty out of place because the house is very symmetrical. What is on one side is on the other side. The landscape is very symmetrical. I don't know how to get to the front door, to be very honest with you. There's got to be a path here somewhere with such a grand staircase. I borrowed it from the internet, so we're going to have to go to the website to do a tour of this house to see if we can actually get in. Because maybe the front door is just there to say, hi, everybody, how's it going? And nobody ever uses it. So if we take a look at this, and this is in our backyard, the emphasis is really on the structure itself. Not only is it just the structure, but we also have lighting elements that'll help it to be at night. We've got the tree next to it. We've got the color next to it. So we really are drawing our eye to this area here. You really don't notice the neighbor's shed over to, or the neighbor's house over to the side, because that's not where your eye's going to go first. Your eye's going to go directly to that focal point, and you're going to look at it and you're going to examine it and you're going to go for that color. You're going to go for that thing that's a little bit different from the rest of it. So did the principles all make sense? Okay. So the next part is we are going to move on to those landscape design elements. So what those are is line, form, texture, and color. So to start off with line. Line is the contours and the curves. So if you've ever taken a look, so my first job, well, I guess you could call it a job, was mowing lawns. And when you mow lawns, you notice the lines on the ground a little bit differently than if you're walking by. So I will just tell you that because when you're mowing a lawn, it's really hard to get the lawnmower into those 90-degree corners, right? You always have that little tuft of grass back in the corner. So what we want to do with the line is we'd like to have some contours. We want to have some curves to it. Not only is it visually appealing, but it's also nice for the person running the lawnmower so they don't have to get the weed whacker out or the weed whip out or those little shears to cut that grass out of that tight corner. So we want to make sure that those lines on the ground are something that we can follow, that they're curves. If we have corners, we need to make sure that the corners match up and they make sense, because nothing drives me more nuts is when you have a wonky corner and then you have a sidewalk that keeps going. You just have weird angles. So we need to make sure that that line might not be the spotlight of the landscape, but it's always there. And if something's wrong with the line on the ground, you'll spot it, but you won't quite be able to put your finger on it. So we talked about forms a little while ago. Forms are the shape of the plant or the hardscape out in there. So if you remember the hydrangea example, we had that pyramidal shaped form of the hydrangea. We had the pyramidal shaped form of the evergreens in the background. So we want to try to use that form again. We want to use that repetition in that landscape. This form is a man-made form, obviously. When you hedge things, the kicker is you need to make sure that you do it properly. So nothing drives me more nuts than when I drive down the highway. We have a restaurant, and they really want their trees to be these perfect, tight little pyramids. You can tell how tall the ladder is because it's perfect little pyramids up to the point where they have the ladder, and then there's this little puff out the top. So they really want that pyramidal shaped form, they're just not able to get it. So that's one thing, is if you are gonna have a formal or a very managed landscape and you want a specific form like a meatball or a nice pyramid, you need to make sure that you're able to do it correctly and do it properly in order to have the landscape look the way that you want. So if we take a look at this picture, what is a form that pops out at you? The meatballs, right. The meatballs down in the front. We have meatballs here, we have meatballs here, we have meatballs here, and meatballs back here. We have a big one here. And then we also, like we talked about, the arch, yep. We're seeing those grasses. We're seeing that looser type of an arch type of a form with those grasses. You could say that the yucca would also kind of repeat that similar type of form that we would have from the grass with that upright kind of arching forms. The lines in the pavers, we've got some more jagged edges and lines in the pavers. That one's a good one too. We have vertical forms. We can't overlook the tree trunks. They're another thing that we will see when we're out in the landscape, but that's another element that we have, is we have those lines that go vertical. So we need to make sure that that form works for that space. We want to try to use the same form and different sizes, different textures, different colors. No matter what we do when we do those contrasting form, one is always going to be dominant. So if we take a look at our previous picture, we have lots of different forms in here. The one that pops out at you is going to be, at least to me anyway, is going to be the meatballs. Just because we have so many different sizes of meatballs in here and so many different colors of meatballs in this picture, that it just keeps repeating and repeating and repeating. Texture is one of the ones that sometimes if it's off, we really can't put our finger on it, but when it's done right, it makes it look so nice. So with texture, it lasts beyond color because it's always gonna be there. Any form and any size can be any texture. So we talk about those super fine textures. We have the big, bold, coarse textures. Sometimes it changes seasonally. Sometimes it can be high contrast or subtle. So we can have big, bold textures next to little fine textures, and we're gonna see that difference in those textures. And then it's also seen in relationship to its surroundings. So we might see one plant in one environment and we're like, oh, that's fine texture. And then we put it in a different environment and we're gonna think, no, that's a big, bold texture, because it's all in relationship to what's around it. So if we take a look at the grasses and the perennials in here, we have some different textures. We take a look at the Elijah Blue in the front and in the back. It looks super, super fine compared to the yucca. But if we were to put yucca next to a big, bold leafed viburnum, it's gonna look fine compared to that viburnum. So like we said, that texture is all in relationship to its surroundings. Sometimes it's high contrast, but sometimes it's subtle, and it all depends on what's around it and its surroundings. So some of the plants that we might think of have big, bold textures. Think of a catalpa. Think of how big those catalpa leaves are. Think about what the flowers look like. Think about what the bean pods look like. So throughout the growing season, we've got a different texture. When those bean pods are out, it looks a little bit finer. When the leaves are out, it's big, bold. When we've got those flowers on there, it's a little bit finer. So that's one of the ones that we have. Now compare that leaf in your mind of the catalpa to the Kentucky coffee tree. Kentucky coffee tree is a compound leaf, so it's got lots of little tiny leaflets on it. And then it's got a different pod on it. To me, these pods are like, locust pods on steroids. They're really big and fat, really big and tough. I don't know how else to explain them. But compare the two plants. If you take a look at a catalpa, we've got a bold texture. If we compare it to the Kentucky coffee tree, we've got a finer texture. We take a look at the bean pod, we switch it around. The bean pod on the catalpa is finer textured because it's smaller and skinnier. And then we look at it compared to the seed pod of the Kentucky coffee tree. It's big, it's bold, it's going to demand attention. We can also get texture from bark. Think about like a paper birch or river birch or some of those birches. We're going to get a little bit of different texture appearance from those compared to a willow or an apple or some of those. Think about the textures of the bark on like a sycamore, where we have the white bark with the big plates on it, or the shagbark hickory that flakes up on it. So we can even get textures from the trunks of the trees themselves in addition to the leaves that are on them. And then, like we said, texture is all relative. So we've got the lamb's ear down in front. It's usually a bigger, bolder, kind of fuzzier texture, but next to the lady's mantle, it doesn't look all that big. So bold textures always move forward. They move towards you. They're going to demand your attention. The finer textures are going to go to the background. They're going to start to recede. And then if we add color in there, we're going to add another different dimension to that landscape. So if we look at Jack Frost Brunera here in the front, we don't normally think of Jack Frost as being a big, bold texture. You put it next to the Angelonia sedum, Jack Frost automatically becomes that big, bold texture. It's coming towards you. The Angelonia and then the grasses are moving away from you. They're receding because they're the finer textures in that instance. So lastly is color. So we did line, we did form, we did texture, and now it's color. Next to the river birch was a willow with that one. So with color, color will change with the day, the time of the year, the weather conditions, the maturity of the plant or the plant part. So think about a flower. Does the flower stay the same color as it first comes out to when it's done? Flowers tend to fade. Color itself can be its own focal point at certain times of the year. So it's something that we need to use not sparingly, but we need to be cognizant of the colors that we have. And at certain times of the year, if we're going to have a plant that's going to have a pretty bloom on it, it's going to have a lot of color at that time of the year, it's going to be our focal point. So we need to make sure we put it in a proper location where we can use that focal point, or it's somewhere we want to draw our eye and our attention to. So what affects color? We have light, the proximity, texture, background, and contrast all can affect color. If we look at early spring skies compared to fall skies, the colors of the sky is going to be different, and that's going to have an effect on the way that we see that plant material. Colors are going to look totally different early in the morning compared to in the afternoon. So those colors are going to make a big difference too. So early in the morning, that early light, that Brunera, you can kind of see through it. It's got that really fun dark green glossy leaf on it. And then we've got some of the spurge down in front that's got more of a blue-green kind of a color to it, mixed in with some of that sedum that commands your attention because it's a different color than what we were seeing out in the landscape. So if we take a look at color in this one, it's a different time of the year, different time of the day, makes a difference in the way that we see that plant material. We're looking more towards later in the day, different time of the season, and that makes a difference on that color. As we get to the fall of the year, that will play a difference too, because the skies are a little bit different color than they are earlier in the season. So that can all make a big difference too. And those of you that have heard me talk before, what color is in this landscape? I'll wait till somebody responds. There we go. Green. So I want to ask you a very serious question. We learn about the color green when we're in preschool and kindergarten. But why is it when we get out to the landscape, none of us see the color green, or the color green is not a real color that we use? So green is a color, though it's not the showiest color that we have, and pretty much most of the plant material is green. We still need to keep in mind that green is a color when it comes to the landscape. So in order to understand color, we have to know a little bit about the color wheel. It's been a few years since I've taken art class, but there are 12 colors. There's the 3 primary, which are the blue, the yellow, and the red. There's 3 secondary, which are the violet, the orange, and the green. And then there's 6 tertiary, which fill in the gaps between. So when we look at the color wheel, there's going to be colors that warm us up. Those are going to be the energetic colors. Those are going to be the warm colors that come out towards you. They're going to demand your attention, and they're going to say, look at me right now. Usually they're going to have a type of a yellow undertone to them. The cool colors are going to recede. They're going to go away from you. Usually going to have a blue undertone to them. They're going to be calm. They're not going to demand your attention like some of those warm colors like yellows and oranges and reds. They're really going to stand out, and they demand your attention. So complementary colors are across from each other on the color wheel. Those have strong contrast. So we take a look at the poppies. We've got the red and the green. We're across from each other on the color wheel. They demand your attention. They have the most contrast that we can have out in the landscape. And then there's a whole bunch more combinations that we can have. We can have triads, which are equidistant from each other on the color wheel. They all kind of work together. They're kind of middle of the road. We have analogous, which are next to each other on the color wheel. They might not show enough contrast, but they all work kind of well together. And then we've got the monochromatic, which are shades of tints of the same color. So when we take a look at analogous, like I said, those are next to each other on the color wheel. So we've got the green, the yellow, green, and the yellow. We've got the blue, violet, and the violet, or the red, violet, the violet, and the blue. They are all next to each other in the color wheel. They all work well, they're all nice, and they go together, but there might not be a lot of contrast between those. Monochromatic, shades and tints of the same color. So we've got all yellows, we have all pinks. It's just a matter of lightness to darkness and what the shades are with some of those colors. So what do we have in this landscape? Do we have analogous or monochromatic or complementary? Yep, your choices were analogous, monochromatic, or complementary. Complementary are across each other from the color wheel. Analogous are all in that same general area. So what we have in this one is analogous. We have the red violet, the violet, and the blue violet. I guess you could call the almapodgki, the aster in the background. We could go up to reddish pink and then red, violet, and violet. But we've got all of them in that same general area on the color wheel. We also have those plants that act as blenders. They allow for visual transition. They're usually toned down. They're not a real bright color that stands out. They're usually quote unquote a neutral color, which in the landscape neutral tends to be green or possibly brown. And so if we take a look, we have some of the grasses that can allow to be blenders. The lady's mantle down at the bottom can be a blender. And the pentacetum in this one also acts like a blender as well. So the next question I have for you as a group, we've been talking for about an hour. We can do our activity now, or I can finish the growing environment and then we can do the activity. Does anybody have any suggestions either way they want to do it?
So here's my suggestion.
Okay.
So if we do it now, we could get some pictures or some video of what they did and be able to see everybody else's.
Let's do it now. So let me find that slide. There we go. Hopefully, oops, you're not seeing that, are you?
Nope.
We'll try again.
We see that you were shopping at Sam's Club.
Nope, it's not too late. I need to renew my membership. That better?
Yep.
Yep. So our activity, what we're going to do is we're going to take about 30 minutes. Now is the time to also take your break. What we should have brought with us today is we're going to use those landscape design principles that we learned. Unity, repetition, line, form, texture, color, all of those. As a team at your location, or if you want to do it as an individual, that's fine too. What we're going to do is we're going to design a miniature landscape within that box. You're going to use potting mix as a base, and then you're going to build on it with either found items, or I've had people dig out of the trash before. Anything is fair game. So what we're going to do is we're going to give you 30 minutes. Once your 30 minutes is up, we're going to report back to the group at your location. You're going to talk about what you did and why you did it and why the plants were placed in that specific location. I will be asking for examples, so be prepared. So we're going to need to answer these questions. We need to know what your concept was. Why did you put that in there? What is it? What's going on in this box? What the purpose for those plants are? If you want them to block the wind, if you want them to look pretty, if you wanted to pond because you want to hear the sound of water. That's something that we need to know. And then we also need to know any specific characteristic that that plant might have. So if we put a plant in that location, does it have good fall color? Does it have multiple seasons of interest? Why did we put that there? And we need to know, like I said, why it was placed in that location. Are there any questions about this? Now is your chance. Okay, with no questions, I will be in my other room. If you have them, please type them into the chat pod or speak up and I will try to answer your questions. But in 30 minutes, we're going to come back to the rest of the group and we're going to talk about it. So be prepared at 8 o'clock to report back. If you have a camera, be prepared to get your designs next to your camera so we can see some examples. And then we need to answer those questions that we have up on the screen. What are your concept? What's your purpose? What's the characteristics? And why were the plants put in that location?
So it's 7:24. That gives you 6 minutes for your break. And it gives you 30 minutes for your activity. And I am going to put this on pause so we're not recording 30 minutes of dead air.
What?
Sorry.
Fine.
All right, you got 5 minutes. All right, it's 7:57. So is everybody getting kind of settled back into their locations?
Yes.
It's tough running back and forth, isn't it? Who is DPSS Sheck? Clay. That one's pretty cool. All right, you ready, Elizabeth?
I am ready.
All right.
So I don't remember who emailed me pictures. I just opened them at the bottom, as you see. So we will start off with the bottom one. I think that just came from John, didn't it? John Thomas?
We don't see any pictures.
Darn it.
You need to share your screen.
I am, but I'm sharing the wrong one. Okay, hold on. Okay. Share my screen. We'll start off with that one. Bam. I don't know who that one is. No takers? No whammy? Alrighty. Then we'll try a different one. Oops. We'll share this one. I think that's from Norfolk. Wayne, is that yours?
Can you guys open your mic and talk?
I have a chat. Oh, well, I guess I won't do any from Norfolk then because they don't have a mic. Ta-da! That's from Norfolk. All right. Let's see what other ones we can share. I will share some of the Hall County ones. And because I didn't email it to myself, we took pictures. Now, I'll just tell you that Hall County got a little, how shall we say, creative with some of the things that we used. The first one you can really truly appreciate until you get it up close and personal. What they did is they took sedum And with that sedum, that's a really bad picture, and I apologize. But with that sedum, what they are doing is they turned it into a tree.
You're sharing the wrong screen again.
I'm not. Am I? I was doing my camera. But that's okay.
All you see is, you gotta stop sharing screen if you want to see your camera. Because we see your computer that says join a meeting.
So now as you see my camera?
Yep.
Okay. We're figuring this out, right?
Yep. And then if they want to see a bigger one, then the attendees need to click on the presenter view so that Elizabeth is big.
I'm figuring it out. Try not to get anybody car sick. What they did, they utilized my snacks.
Tomatoes.
No, those are Jawbreakers and Chex Mix and Sixlets, which I told him was not a good use of my Sixlets.
Can you show the email address again, please?
It's E-Killinger2. It should be in the chat pod. Oh, we should share that one. Okay. And this was one of the first ones that I've got from Red Willow County. Does anybody there have a microphone and want to talk about what they did?
Can you hear us?
Yes.
All right. This is called informal rural. And this is a pond. And this is a little stone walkway. This brown is grass. Sorry about that.
It's dormant. We're good.
Yeah, very dormant. These are our taller trees over here, and our pine tree that's a little tall on this side. And we have some meatballs right here, bushes, and then a little greenery scattered around here. And we carried that over here, little greenery back here. Oh, I don't know did I do that?
Nope.
Okay.
We're good.
And then I thought we had a little bit over here.
We do.
We do, somewhere down in there. So that's about it.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing. We'll try to do a new share. I don't know whose this is.
See?
Anybody claim this one? They used the trash to heart. I can't say I've ever seen Q-tips. Well, thanks, Norfolk. The Q-tips is a nice touch, and the pop lids are a very nice touch as well. We'll do this one. Can you see it?
Yeah, we only see a partial.
I'm trying. I don't know what's going on. I must have killed my camera. There we go. How's that?
Well, looks good.
Okay, so what's going on there, Panhandle?
Okay, well, the pond is our focal point.
Oh,
And
very nice.
our path with the little rail is for rhythm. And we have some little grasses in the corner for texture. A little bench beside the pond there, and some bushes behind it. And some of those meatballs. Those meatball bushes are there too.
Mm.
And this would be like, our trees are for windbreak in the corner there, those twigs. And we decided it must be like early spring because there are a few little tulips popping up there. Those purple and red tulips. So.
Oh, okay, not candy, it's tulips.
No, it's tulips.
Got it. Got it. Oh, geez. Okay. Oh, here's some from Lancaster County. Or not Lancaster, I apologize. From Terry and her group. Maybe, if I can get there. There we go. So what do we got going on in that group in Lincoln? Or maybe not.
Should I come up there?
Yeah.
Yep.
Okay.
There's ceiling mics. You should be able to hear them.
Yep.
And there's ceiling mics.
Ceiling
They
mics.
can hear you. Oh, okay. We built a berm in the back, and then we placed that little green thing back there is supposed to be a bench, like a meditative area. And there's an arch. Was that what we
Yes.
An arch before the bench. So you walk on the path up to the berm, and then there's a little bench there, and we have trees in the back. On the left side is a pond at interest, and I don't know if you guys want to say anything else about it.
You did a good job.
That's pretty much it.
Awesome. So we'll go ahead and we'll switch to another one. Oops, that's the same one. Sorry. That one's a pretty one too. One of our last ones. And I know, oh, there we go. I don't remember who did that one. Any takers on that one? Probably one of the ones that doesn't have a mic, right?
Go into it, please, in the upper.
It's a stockade.
Stockade fence so your neighbors can't see it. One of those 6 foot.
Shower behind.
That's where the jacuzzi is.
Oh yeah, there you go. Shield trash.
So there we go.
No mic.
No.
So we will get back to the PowerPoint. Okay. So if you want to mute your mics again. Thank you. So these were just some examples that we had in the past with some of those other ones. Some of them built buildings. Some of them use trash as stepping stones. That is a fish. Don't ask me, it's a fish. We've done this in the wintertime and they've utilized ice melt for the paths in addition to some of those on the berm. Other ones that they used, we had a potato chip walking path on some of them. And then we've got the lovely fish that are smiling and they're living in the pond as well on some of those. And then some of our trees are on standard, as you see right there, that they are not quite tall enough, so they had to put them on standard. So there's those, and then I have one more to share because I think it's a hoot. This is my Hall County ones. Like I said, they raided the snack drawer and used the Chex Mix and all the components. And then they took out some of my gobstoppers and made gazing balls. They also have a pond with water. And then they've got the bench and the stick, and then they've got some of the evergreens in the background of their pond. And so we've got lots of different things going on there. So I will switch back to my other one and find the plant considerations. Consider the growing environment. Okay, so we'll do considering the growing environment. So right off the bat, when we talk about plant considerations, we need to take into effect the environmental requirements of the growing environment. And then once we have that in place, then we want to start taking a look at the aesthetic quality. That's when we want to select those plants for that form, that function, that texture, and that color. So the growing environment, we have the macro environment and the micro environment. So what that is on large scale, what's going on out in that environment, what's going on in that space, what's going on in that county is the macro environment. When we talk about the micro environment, we're talking on the north side of the house or the south side of the house, because that can make a big difference. It can make a big difference on temperature, sun, moisture, wind, slopes, and soils. It can make a big difference if we're in different locations. So we need to consider that growing environment first before we pick that plant. And I know you'll hear a lot of us say right plant for the right place. If we have those plants that are happy and they're in the right location and they're placed in that area where they're going to grow well, they're not going to be as attractive to some of those pests and pathogens that are out there. Also, some of the management practices, we need to take that into consideration too. If you're going to do a formal hedge like what's in the picture, you want to get it in an area where you can get to it and you can trim it on a regular basis. You want to try to group your higher management practice areas in one location. So if you're going back there week after week, you only have a one-stop shop. Then you don't have to go throughout the entire landscape and hit those high management practices in those different locations. So for aesthetic quality, we have to take into consideration the place first. What do you have and what do you want? What do you want that plant to do? What's the function of that plant? Not only what's the desired function, but what's the actual function? Because the desired function might be that we want a red fall color plant that doesn't shed leaves or shed twigs, and it looks good any time of the year. But the actual function of that plant is you want something for shade. And what do you have for the growing environment? Do you have a sunny spot? Do you have a shady spot? Do you have a hell strip or an inferno strip between the sidewalk and the street that you know is going to get salt, that you know is going to be hot, that's not going to be the ideal place for most plants to live? So we need to know what we have and what we want for that spot. And then we need to take into consideration that management. For those plants like grasses where we cut them back once in the spring and we're done, that's great. If you're going to have a more formal hedge type of an environment where you have to be out there trimming it on a regular basis, we need to make sure we take that management into consideration. So after we have the place, after we figure out what we have, and after we figure out what we want that to do, then we're going to pick those plants. And right off the bat, we're going to pick it based on its scale, then on its form, then on its texture. What's not listed is color. But when everybody picks a plant out at the landscape, what's the first thing that you pick out that plant based on? 90% of the time, we're looking at color. Whether it's the color of the leaves, the color of the blooms, but we really want it to, for what that plant's going to be used for, and can it fit into that space? You don't want a large overstory tree shoved in a little tiny space because it's going to look like it's going to take up that entire space. So we need to make sure that we have the scale first, the form, the texture, and then lastly we pick on color. So what's our design intent for that space? Do we want to in-frame or enclose that space? I know on that little design we had that fence. Keep the neighbors out. We're enclosing that space. Are we trying to draw our focus or attention to a particular place or a particular plant in the landscape? Are we trying to guide traffic? Are we trying to screen, modify a climate, multiple seasons of interest? Whatever we want to do, we have to know before we put that plant in the ground. Multiple seasons of interest, we have a handful of plants that'll do that. Or if you want to do that with different plants, having the spotlight at different times of the year, that's another thing to consider. So like I talked about, once you know what you have, once you know the growing environment, once you know the space that you have, and once you know what you want, then we put the plants in. And then we meet the requirements based on that of the client. So I've had a landscaper I just talked to, and he said when he walks up to somebody's landscape, he asks them what they want out of their landscape. And their response is, I don't care, do whatever you want or you think looks good. So his response is to do whatever he thinks that looks good. He says every time, 3 to 4 years down the road, I don't like X, I don't like Y, I don't like this. And he said that what he's had to do is sit down with them and really interview them hard upon what they really want. What are your likes? What are your dislikes? If you don't like the color orange, say you don't like the color orange. If you say you want Nebraska style, understand what Nebraska style means. So we need to make sure that we insert those plants based upon what we have and what the growing conditions are and what we like, so we're not unhappy down the road. Do we want things to blend in, or do we want things to stand out? Do you like it really traditional, or do you like it really trendy? Are you someone who wants something very structured or casual? Oftentimes we have people that want plants from a specific region. They want them from this place, or we want them from that place. We love color, but my favorite one is I had somebody who the husband was very formal, ducks in a row, alternating plant material in specific color palette, because that color palette matched the color that the house was at that point in time. Wife, on the other hand, wanted everything to be colorful. She wanted multiple seasons of interest. She wanted bloom anytime that she could get a bloom. And so the hard part then is trying to mesh that aesthetic quality. You've got the very formal husband with limited color palette. You've got the very colorful wife with a very more informal, almost natural type of a theme that she wanted. And so that's something to keep in mind too, is what do you like? Because it's your landscape when we all get done. Seasons of interest. You can do all your eggs in a basket, do a flash in the pan, do all your emphasis at a single season or a single spot with a single texture or color. So down in the lower corner, it's flash in the pan, spring of the year, that's when your big bang's gonna be. You've got all those bulbs down there, you've got them all in bloom about the same time, but what happens when all those bulbs begin to fade? That landscape is going to look totally different once those bulbs begin to fade and go. So we need to make sure that if we've got throughout the season, we have something to look at in the different locations throughout the yard or in the landscape, or we have plant material that gives us that multiple season. So that change of the focal emphasis can be with time, because at some point in times, not only of the year, but of their life cycle, plants may be more interesting to look at, or maybe after they go through their awkward teenage years, they may look a little better. So those plants are going to change with time. So for all seasons of interest, we want to combine those woody and those herbaceous plants. We want to try to use hardscapes and garden elements. Now we want to try to look at it from all vantage points, from every point throughout the yard. We want to make sure that we can see different plant material that might catch our interest at that point in time. Screening for unsightly objects for all seasons. Some of us have neighbors. Some of us have things that we don't necessarily want to look at year-round. So we want to screen those unsightly objects so we don't have to see them, especially in the winter of the year if we've got deciduous shrubs next to them. Or maybe if it's something that we really don't want to see, maybe we talk about putting in a fence so we really don't have to see it no matter what time of the year it is. And then we want to leave seed heads from that interest, that winter interest, like the rudbeckias. Leave your grasses stand. Try to give as many things to look at during those winter months as at all possible. And then with that seasonal interest, you can emphasize one spot with a color or a texture at any one time, so your interest might change. Your experience is going to change throughout the season. Combine those woody and herbaceous like we talked about, and look and see. So spring of the year. What does your eye go toward in the spring of the year? In this picture, it's the red buds. That bright magenta color against that green background, it really makes them to pop, and that's what your eye is going to go toward. Now, as the summer progresses and those leaves turn green, are you going to notice those red buds quite as much? They're going to be a little bit different form, but we're not going to notice them quite as much as we do in the spring of the year because the color is muted and that seasonal interest has changed with them. Here's another picture. A little bit earlier in the season, we've got some flowers in bloom, and that changes throughout the season. What does it look like in winter? Totally different spot, or totally different look to it. If you really want to see the forms in a landscape, either, and I learned this from Kim Todd, either make the picture black and white or look at it in the winter. Then you can really see the form. You can see the rounded form of this tree versus the rounded form of this tree, the peak shape of this one. So what are the major forms in the landscape are easy to look at when they're black and white or in the winter. And then when we talk about plant requirements, we want to put plants with similar growing conditions in the same spot. We want to group them or mass them, preferably in mulch beds, so that way we don't have to worry about the lawnmower eating them or getting them. We want to keep them away from the turf for that reason, if at all possible. And we need to keep in mind that the roots extend beyond the edges of landscape beds. They'll go into the turf, they'll go into those surrounding areas. So it's not like the landscape begins and ends where you have that hard line. We're going to have plants that are going to kind of grow out of their little spot. They're going to go over that boundary. They might go onto the sidewalk or beyond those edges. So we need to keep that in mind when we plan ahead. And this is just one of those examples. We're keeping those beds distinct from the turf. These people put hardscape underneath the benches, so we don't have to try to mow the grass under the benches, which is always nice. And we group those plants and we massed them together because you're going to get more visually appealing, more bang for your buck. It's going to dry your eye a little better if you group those plants together than if you were to put one and one and one over here. Here's another example. This is more of a shaded environment. What we do is we have those masses of plantings together. So we've got the burning bush in the background. We've got some of the iris over on this side, and there's equal iris on that side. We've got the hostas in there. So the pachysandra down in the front, distinct from the turf. Plants are grouped together. We have that unity like we talked about in the repetition with the same plant material on similar sides. So we're using all those principles that work. And fast forward. And so this little bit here, we're going to talk about some of the common mistakes that I see. It's just for fun. It's not necessarily anything wrong. But it's just some of the common mistakes that we see out in the landscape when we're taking a look. And it's just something to keep in mind when you're planning a landscape. So to start off, my favorite is the poor proportion or the poor scale. Or I understand that plants don't read the plant tag, but at least you have a general idea approximately how big we're going to be. If we take a look at the big picture, this is a cute little blue spruce that is not mature, which means it's going to eat the house. It is already going to grow into the power line. It's already growing under the overhang with that light. So your choice is either to prune it out around that or let it eat the house. There's also a hose bib here. And as a kid, my folks had yew bushes next to the house. So you had to think skinny thoughts to shimmy between that little yew bush and the house. So think about what it's going to be like to eat spruce needles when you're trying to reach that hose and that hose bib when it gets a little bigger. The one on the other side, that's what a mature blue spruce is going to look like. So you need to keep in mind, 40 foot tall, 40 foot wide. I put it in a little spot 6 feet away from the house. It's going to eat the house. For proportion and scale, this one, it's more of a, let's take a look from all vantage points in the landscape. So if we try to look out our window right here, what are we going to see? You're going to see the shrub and you're going to see the tree. Now we talk about when the landscape ages, it's going to look a little different. It's going to look a little different. These shrubs are going to get bigger and this tree is going to limit itself up with time. So you're eventually going to be able to look out that one window at the tree trunk. So we need to make sure that we have the right plant material at the right scale in the right spot. We don't want a large plant in front of a window. We want to be able to look out our window. And we talked earlier about that big live oak out in front of that big mansion. What happens if it was a smaller house? In this instance, they used some smaller trees in front of this house. Does it look horrible? No, but they just look out of scale in relationship to this. And a lot of these plants aren't going to get much bigger. So oftentimes what we see is we take a look at our landscape and we look at the ground and we decide that's the area that we're going to landscape. And we very rarely take into consideration like sun, shade, wind. Sometimes people forget about sight lines out the windows or off the deck or out the front door. And then also realize that the landscape does not end at the property line. And there's other things that we can take into consideration. Like if we have neighbors, we need to take into consideration those neighbors. So we look in a bubble. We're like, okay, we're going to design a landscape plan. We're going to put these plants in these locations for that particular reason. Where's the front door? If you're driving by this house, you have no idea where that front door is located at because you can't see it. It may look good on paper to have these birch flanking either side, but it's totally covering up the house. So we can't even see the front door here behind this chokecherry, the Schubert chokecherry. We have to look up as well as down and around when we do a landscape. So what we need to take into consideration is those power lines. Are there power lines that might be a risk? Or we might have a tree that grows up in it? There's a street here in Grand Island, and I'm not sure if the power lines were in first or if the trees were in first, but all of the trees have had to be pruned pretty severely so they can fit under the power line because no one looked up when they planted the tree to see if they were going to grow into it. There are some people that will go to all lengths so they don't even have to look at their neighbors. This is a very extreme example of people that don't like their neighbors. But like we talked about that scale, that gives a pretty clear message to those neighbors that they don't want to see what's on the other side. I don't know how they're going to pull in their garage. This is one of those where it was a contractor that put the shed in and didn't take a look at the rest of the landscape when they did that. Or they didn't take a look at the landscape when they were installing it because neither one of those garage doors is usable. The trees are in the way. This one is one of my favorites. And the reason I say that is because it's something that we all want to do. We all want to play plant ping pong. And we want to go one and one and one and one. And we want to go back and forth. Well, the hard part is what happens if one of these little round meatballs happens to die? Do we try to put it in with a new meatball? We can't put something else in there because that would throw off the pattern that we have going on in front. But what we would rather do is mass plant material together. So ideally, we'd have 3 boxwoods in this location. We'd have 3 or 4 of the azaleas in this location, and we try to lump them together so that way we're not having to go back between. I wish I had taken a picture, but there was a spot in Lincoln where in one of the parking lot medians, the person had put in both the different colors of barberry. They put in the red barberry and the gold barberry. Well, with time, it did exactly what's in this picture. The red barberry took off, the gold barberry not so much. So it went from having racing stripes to being all red at some point in time. And when you do plant ping pong and you no longer have the gold because the red barberry ate it, it really makes a difference on that pattern that you're trying to show people. We can have similar colors and still play ping pong. Say that really fast, just saying. You can still have plant ping pong back and forth where you're not real sure which one to go between. You have 3 of them there like you're supposed to, but there's that one in the middle. So one of these things is not like the other. They messed up on their plant ping pong. This one here at the end should be flanking, should be a meatball. So we have a square, around, a square, around, a square, around. But with that, we're alternating those forms. Yes, there's a little bit of interest in there, but yeah. And I will just ask a rhetorical question is how many of you have yard art? How many of you have this much yard art? Like I said, I mowed lawns for my first job. I would cringe if I had to mow this yard because the yard art is placed directly on the lawn. What that means is you have to probably either move the yard art and try to mow around it, or you have to get the string trimmer and go around each one of those pieces of yard art, which neither one is going to be much fun. But if you just go on the internet, there's lots of fun stuff. This is obviously not in Nebraska, but what they did is they made a yin and a yang sign out of their rock mulch in their area. And I will just use this as a disclaimer. I will just say we rent. In our past rental house, they had done a little work in the bathroom, and they decided that the toilet would be good yard art. And what they had done is they put a planter down in the bowl area, and they put flowering plants down in there. And it was right outside the big bay window into the off of the living room, out the big bay window, and you had to look at it every day. So I will just say that was interesting use of a planter. We left it, but it was, yep. Flamingos. My mom's a flamingo collector, not a real flamingos, of flamingo stuff. So someday I bet I will see a lot of flamingos like this. And more yard art. That's a lot of yard art. And again, placed directly on the lawn where you got to mow around them all. Then we get into the bad mulching or the poor mulching practices. We'll talk about volcano mulch. And when we talk about volcano mulch, this is exactly what we're talking about. Ideally, we'd like to have a ring of mulch 2 to 3 inches deep spread out around the base of the tree. We don't want to pile the mulch up around the trunk of the tree because then it makes a volcano and the tree doesn't do very well. So ideally, we'd like to spread this mulch out. There are some instances where there can be quite a bit of mulch around these 2 trees, and ideally, like I said, we'd like to spread that out so for the overall health of the plant. If you get on Pinterest, there's a lot of great ideas for you. So if you take a look at this spiraling vortex of mulch with 2 different colors, think about long term. Yes, it's pretty right now, but with time that red mulch is going to lose its color. What happens if you have a heavy rain event or a lot of wind like we don't have in Nebraska? That mulch is not going to have that pretty swirling effect to it. And then do you want people to take a look at your mulch, or do you want people to take a look at the landscape itself? Granted, this is an early season picture, but with time, those plants are all going to be green, and then you've got multiple things going on in that picture. And then there are some products that in the right location, they can do a good job. This is one of them. It's lava rock. And in My Brother's Afraid of Snakes, I will just throw that out there. Lava rock is one of the methods that we can use to help control snakes, but it has to be very deep and a long ways away. But think about those poor little pansies sitting there in that lava rock in the Nebraska heat. They're not going to fare very well long term. So right plant for the right place, but those pansies don't have a snowball's chance. And then my favorite mulching practice is the rubber mulch. And I know Rakaswal would go on about rubber mulch, but rubber mulch is made out of tire shreds. It comes in blue because blue is a natural color in the environment, in the landscape, that you can get. I've seen dyed green as well. But if we put it around the landscape in like a public location like this, rubber mulch is flammable. So it can smolder and it can start to take off. In the right location, like a children's playground or something along those lines, it's a great addition to that, but it just doesn't break down with time. And like I said, it is can be a little bit of hazard. And then we have bad angles or bad placement. I just know that if I was mowing this, I would not be very happy. For one, yes, I do have a very nice bed line that I can follow. It's curved, it's easy to mow around, and then you have to go around and mow in between all these things. And my guess is that location there between the curb and whatever that is not very wide, so you won't be able to get a mower in there. So this is one of those locations where I just do a landscape bed all the way around. You know, lazy people are going to walk straight through here. They're not going to go around to the edge. So keep that in mind and don't put plant material in that spot. Some more bad placement. I understand plants don't read the plant tag. And when we put a plant next to the landscape, we figure out about how big it's going to get, and we put it out again away from the house, and then we take another big step out. So that way we have enough room to walk in between there. Like I said, we had yews next to my house growing up, and my uncle who did the landscape didn't do that. So every year we had to try to shimmy back behind the yew shrubs to wash windows, or shimmy back behind the yew shrubs to even turn the spigot on. So we need to make sure we put those plants in that location where we don't have to worry about giving them a good old haircut to get them off of the sidewalk so we can use the full 3-foot sidewalk. And we have the plant that ate the lamppost. Not the right plant for that location. And they're trying to use the lamppost if at all possible. And we're only going to be shaded on that one side. Again, how do we use that front door sidewalk? How do we look out that window on a regular basis? So a lot of these plants have those foundation hugging plants on there. Foundation plants are great if they're not hugging directly up against that foundation. And then the last one is the dead horse berm. What happens is it's a berm that goes wrong. It looks like somebody buried trigger under the berm. What happens, and a lot of times, is that top of the berm is really dry. The sides of the berm are dry because the water doesn't have that possibility to soak in. And so what oftentimes we'll see is a river birch placed on top of the berm because river birch, like their name implies, they like it to be a little bit wetter environment. And so a lot of times we'll see them struggle up on top of that berm because that berm is not allowing a lot of moisture to soak in. And then also if we try to mulch this dead horse berm like they've done here, in Nebraska, we wouldn't have very much mulch left on it. It'd either wash off or it'd blow off on a day like today. So that's something else to keep in mind, is that mulch is really hard to keep on that type of a slope too. Somebody buried trigger. And then we have a bunch of them. We can have poor installation. For example, out around my office here, if you ever want to come take a visit, when it was installed 25 years ago, They left the wire baskets and the burlap around all the trees that they installed. So needless to say, a 25-year-old honey locust only has a trunk about yay big. So it's got a few issues. Then we've got the poor management. Either we don't understand what the plant needs or we don't understand what management it requires. So either we don't do enough or we do too much. We have scalping the lawn. That one's a good one too. Poor plant choices for those locations. I think topiaries are fun, but they're fairly difficult for a home landscape in order to do them right. I've only seen it done one time, and that was in Clarkson, and they made doves. It was pretty fun. House hugging foundations, and then we can't even forget about topping trees. And so those are some of them. We're not going to have landscape design practice today, everyone. I'm sorry, we already had one. But if you want to, the rest of those are landscape design practice. You can landscape my house. I will gladly let you, the house that I'm living in right now. If you have some plans, go ahead and let me know. These are some of the resources that you can use. And then I will open the floor up for questions. We have about 15 minutes left. So if you guys have questions, now is your time to ask.
Hey, I have a question here, and I have them on speaker so they can talk.
You mentioned something about a Nebraska garden or a Nebraska landscape. What's that?
The Nebraska style landscape. It's using those plant materials that are hardy for Nebraska. A lot of times it's going to be some of the grasses. We're going to see some of the more native or hardy plants. For our area, it's not formalized and structured. It's a little bit more informal, a little bit easier going, but that's what they consider the Nebraska style. Home security, definitely home security should be considered when you're planning a landscape. So one of the things that we've done in the past is if you have a landscape and if you, let's say that you have burglars and you don't want burglars to be underneath your window. What you can do then is put roses or something thorny on that area. This also works well if you have small children next door and you don't want them to run over to your landscape. You put a bunch of barberry or a bunch of roses, and that acts as a natural barrier. Also keeps people from cutting across your landscape or cutting across your property line. Yes, panhandle prior to digging. Everyone needs to call 811? Digger's Hotline. At least 2 days prior to digging, and they say that even goes if you're digging at least 12 inches down. Are there any other questions? And another thing with home security, and they do it here at our back door every time. They have a big tree that blocks the view. So if I was to look out the door, I couldn't be able to see if there's anybody out on the other side. So sometimes keeping things a little shorter, a little trimmed up. That also help with landscape design and also dealing with home security. Okay, David, with xeriscaping landscape and incorporating color, just because you have something xeriscape doesn't mean it necessarily doesn't have color. Xeriscaping is just those plants that use water smartly or use water without wasting it. And so for us, sometimes xeriscaping can be those native grasses or those native plants. And so some of those plants can have color at that time too. So thanks everybody. I'll stay on for a little bit longer if you continue to have questions, or you have my email address if you want to email me questions too. Foundation plants that don't get too large. Well, it all makes a difference on what side of the house we're talking about. You know, the good old standard that I believe was around my house was the lovely spirea. That's always a fun one. Another one is always a yew, but you can do some of the other plants as a foundation plant, like some of the viburnums. You can get by with even some, I have daylilies as a foundation plant, 2 to 3 feet. Like again, it depends on your location and the growing environment, what you have going on. I really want to grow some hydrangeas on the north side of my house someday. They'll make a nice foundation plant too, so it all makes a difference if you're looking at woody or herbaceous. This is a reminder for everybody that I believe next week is a bye week. Unless you're in Hall County, then I will be teaching you again. So we do not have a program on tap for next week. But then the following week, we will have entomology. Oh, and West Central too. So some of you, if you're just doing the Zoom trainings, we don't have the Zoom training next week. Some specific locations do have trainings in those locations, so be sure to double check. But in a couple weeks, Jonathan and Natalia will be talking about entomology. I don't have it written down any more than that, but they're talking bugs. So if there's no more questions, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the recording, I think, and I'll stop sharing my screen. And if you want to type me or email me questions, feel free to do so.